Ferocious bear terrifies everyone until a female veteran appears, unveiling a shocking past in the heart of Montana's Bitterroot Forest. The pines rose like silent sentinels, and the wind carried the scent of cold earth and old secrets. A legend stirred beneath the canopy. Locals had named him Brutus, though few had ever laid eyes on him. They called him the Phantom of the Pines, a ghost of muscle and shadow as vast as a small car and twice as silent. His coat was the color of damp bark, his eyes like polished amber, watchful, intelligent, haunting. He had once been just another wild bear, part of the forest's breath and rhythm, until human cruelty etched new meaning into his story. A rusted steel trap, meant to maim and harvest him for parts, had nearly taken his hind leg. The scar ran deep, both in flesh and memory. Since then, Brutus had become more than a bear. He was fear incarnate to hunters, reverence to old woodsmen, and a cautionary tale to campers. He stalked the land alone, his movements strategic, his presence so elusive that even trail cameras often caught only the whisper of his passing. Yet he was always there, watching, learning, remembering. Miles from the nearest town, tucked into the fringe of that forest, stood a modest cabin built from rough-hewn logs and stubborn solitude. It was here that Nora Hayes arrived, her past stitched tight behind her ribs like old shrapnel. A former military sergeant, she had endured 2 tours that stripped more from her than medals could ever return. Her silence was not born of indifference, but survival. PTSD was the ghost she carried, one that sat heavily on her shoulders and screamed in her dreams. After a year of failed therapies, her caseworker suggested a pilot rehabilitation program, solitude, immersion in nature, far from the clang of metal and the smell of diesel and smoke. That's how she ended up in the care of Ethan Caldwell. Ethan had lived in the forest longer than most of the trees. He walked between them like a whisper, once a wildlife specialist, now retired and quietly vigilant. He had taken to monitoring the region's animal activity with quiet diligence and a collection of solar-powered cameras placed in carefully chosen locations. It wasn't just research for him, it was reverence. He had watched Brutus for years. When the scarred bear limped back into range, his coat darker than before, his gait slower, but his eyes unchanged, Ethan knew something had happened. Reviewing the footage late one night, Ethan saw it, the trap, the blood, the fury. He also saw something else, calculated decisions, intelligence that surpassed mere instinct. Brutus wasn't reacting, he was thinking. Nora's arrival came just days after the first sighting near the creek. Ethan explained the situation in a calm, measured tone over a mug of percolated coffee. Stay away from the water early morning or dusk, Brutus favors it. He's hurt. Don't make sudden moves, and if you do see him, don't run. Nora only nodded, her eyes distant, as though Ethan were speaking through glass. She spent most days walking silent trails, her boots crunching over pine needle fingers, twitching at every snapped twig. The forest hush mirrored her own. She felt both comforted and confronted by it. The first time she saw the creek at dawn, it looked like a memory. Mist lifted gently from the water, disturbed only by the occasional darting fish or drop of dew. Nora crouched there alone, breathing in the stillness. She wasn't prepared for what came next, a rustle, not far, not threatening. She stood slowly, every nerve in her body prickling, expecting a deer. But what stepped from the tree-line was no deer. Brutus emerged with the measured weight of a sovereign. His breath fogged in the morning air, his coat shimmering with dampness and shadow. Nora froze, her throat tightening, instincts from years of combat roaring to the surface. The bear's eyes locked onto hers. She saw the scar on his hind leg, matted. He didn't charge. He didn't turn. He simply looked. Time slowed. Her heart pounded, her breath caught somewhere between her lungs and her terror. Somewhere from the farthest corner of her mind, a melody surfaced, an old folk song her mother used to hum on thunder-filled nights. Without thinking, Nora began to sing softly, almost brokenly. The words weren't whole, but the tune carried in the air like mist. Brutus blinked, then astonishingly, he lowered his body to the mossy ground, front paws outstretched, watching, not poised to strike, just watching. When he finally rose again, he turned without a sound and slipped back into the trees, leaving Nora standing by the water, trembling. She didn't speak of the encounter to Ethan that day, not fully. She only asked for antiseptic the next morning and a small kit, gauze, gloves, tweezers, for a wound she found. She said, her voice unsteady. Ethan didn't press. He knew. Over the next few days, Nora returned to the creek at the same hour. She brought no weapons, no tools, just presence. Sometimes Brutus came, sometimes he didn't. When he did, he'd appear silently, easing from the forest like breath from stone. He never came closer than 10 feet, but he didn't retreat either. One morning, Nora sat on the moss with her palms open beside her. Her body relaxed, her eyes avoiding direct contact. Brutus stepped closer. She could hear his breath, smell the musk of fur and wilderness. He let out a low huff and lay down again, as if to say, I see you, I don't fear you. The turning point came a week later when Brutus approached with an uneven gait. The wound had reopened. Nora could see the fresh blood. Without rising, she opened her kit, her hands steady but her heart a storm. Slowly, inch by inch, Brutus edged closer, then stopped just within reach. She leaned forward, whispering softly, not words, but the same melody. When she placed her fingers near his leg, the great bear grunted and flinched, but didn't move away. With impossible gentleness, Nora cleaned the wound, her gloves slick with blood and pine sap. Her breath was shaky, her eyes burned. She hadn't touched another living being in months. That night, she sat by the cabin fire, her fingers still stained, her mind echoing with something she hadn't felt in years: connection. It wasn't just the bear that was healing. For the first time since her return from war, Nora began to speak, to Ethan, to herself, to the woods. Brutus, it seemed, had pulled something loose in her soul, a tether to life, frayed but not severed. Ethan watched quietly. He reviewed the footage from the hidden cameras, seeing Nora crouched beside the massive creature, hands busy with kindness. He didn't report the footage. He didn't notify the authorities, though pressure was mounting. Rumors of Brutus's presence were spreading, carried by broken branches, half-seen tracks, and campfire talk. Officials wanted him trapped, relocated, killed if necessary. But Ethan knew better. Something was happening, something rare and sacred. He called it trust. Others might call it madness. Nora didn't care what anyone called it. She only knew that when she stood by the creek, the forest felt less like a battlefield and more like a home. And when Brutus looked at her with those steady golden eyes, she didn't see danger. She saw a mirror. The days that followed unfolded in quiet rhythm, each one deepening the silent language that had begun between Nora and Brutus. At dawn, she would rise from the cabin. The brittle chill of the mountain air bit through her sleeves as she stepped outside. The pines around her stood as solemn sentries, their trunks dark with early frost. The wind threaded through their branches like whispers. Ethan watched her go each morning without a word, only nodding once, his expression unreadable beneath the rim of his worn-out hat. He never asked where she went. He already knew. Nora walked the narrow trail toward the creek like a pilgrim, moving with a purpose that couldn't quite be explained, even to herself. She never carried anything with weight, no phone, no weapon, not even a walking stick. What she brought instead were the tools of trust, a satchel with antiseptic, bandages, and a folded wool blanket she'd found in a trunk behind the cabin. The forest, once indifferent, now felt alive to her presence. It breathed differently when she passed. Birds watched her from their perches, squirrels pausing in their frantic scrambles as if aware that something sacred was forming beneath the canopy. Brutus began to wait for her, not directly, not in any place she could predict, but nearby. She would find new tracks in the soft soil, tufts of fur caught on brambles, the echo of his breath just ahead before he stepped into view. Their meetings were not dramatic. There was no cinematic emergence, no fanfare, he simply was. Each day, he allowed her a little closer. At first, she would sit 10 feet away while he watched her with cautious eyes. Then it became 7, then 5, until one morning she extended the back of her hand and he huffed a breath over her fingers, massive nostrils flaring as he caught her scent again. He did not pull back. Nora sat perfectly still, her heart pounding like a drum in her ears, her lips parted slightly as though to speak, but no words came. She didn't need them. That moment was enough. The wound on his hind leg had worsened. Ethan had seen it from the camera near the creek's eastern bend and showed Nora the footage with quiet concern. The bear's movement was more deliberate now, favoring the leg, his gait slightly staggered. If it festers, he won't last long, Ethan said simply, setting down the thermos of coffee he held. Nora had stared at the screen, jaw tight, shoulders squared. "Then I need to help him," she'd said. There had been no question in her voice, only decision. Ethan didn't argue. He merely nodded once, then rummaged through an old field kit, handing her stronger salve and a narrow tool for clearing debris. "He'll tell you how far you can go," he said quietly. Listen to him. That morning, the forest felt different, heavier, as if it too understood what was at stake. Nora moved slowly through the underbrush, the cold air sharp in her lungs. She found Brutus already near the creek, lying on a patch of sunlit moss with his eyes half closed. He raised his head when she approached, and she saw no alarm, only recognition. She crouched near him, murmuring a low hum, the same melody she always used. He shifted but did not rise. Instead, he extended the wounded leg slightly, a gesture so subtle she nearly missed it. Her breath hitched. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she slipped on the gloves and opened the kit. The infection was worse than she'd feared. Angry red tissue surrounded the edges, and part of the old trap scar had reopened. Brutus rumbled low in his throat as she began to clean it, but he didn't move away. She worked quickly, tears pricking the corners of her eyes as she flushed the wound, applied pressure, smeared the thick salve, and wrapped it tightly with gauze. When she finished, she rested her palm gently over the dressing. Brutus closed his eyes. That simple gesture shattered something in her. Her throat constricted, and before she knew it, she was speaking, not humming, not whispering, but truly speaking for the first time in what felt like years. "You're not alone," she said softly. "Neither of us are." That night, she told Ethan everything, every detail of the encounter. As he listened, he said nothing, but there was a light in his eyes she hadn't seen before. "I always believed he was more than instinct," he murmured, "but this is something else." Word spread, and whispers carried by Ethan to a trusted colleague in the conservation field, then from there to another. Soon, wildlife professionals, ethical ones, began reaching out with interest. Some expressed awe, others skepticism, but all wanted to understand, how could a bear so traumatized, so feared, form a bond with a human? Nora didn't have answers. She only had presence, and every day she returned to Brutus, that presence deepened. But while the forest held healing, it also held danger. The trap that had maimed Brutus hadn't been a remnant of old poaching lines, it had been freshly laid, calculated, placed illegally by someone who knew where Brutus might roam. Ethan's investigation led him to unsettling rumors. A former mercenary turned poacher named Langford, known for his brutality and rumored ties to the exotic black market trade. Langford had once operated deep in Alaskan ranges, trafficking bear bile and claws to underground buyers. He was cunning, trained, and, worse, he had a personal vendetta. Ethan found footage of the man deep in the woods near the southern quadrant, just outside the sanctuary line, carrying what looked like bait and snares. The realization struck cold. This man wasn't hunting for profit, he was looking for revenge. Ethan didn't tell Nora at first. He didn't want to shatter the fragile progress she'd made. But when Brutus failed to appear for 2 days straight and the cameras near the creek picked up signs of human activity, a cigarette butt, a boot print too clean, Ethan knew the time for silence had passed. He sat with Nora that evening, the firelight casting long shadows across the cabin walls. "He's here," he said, voice low. "Langford, the one who set the trap. He's looking for Brutus." Nora's face went still, not with fear, but something sharper. "Then we don't let him find him first," she said. The next morning brought snow, thick flakes drifted from the sky, blanketing the forest in hush and white. Nora wrapped herself in Ethan's old army parka and moved with practiced care through the trees. The forest had become familiar now, like an old wound that had finally stopped hurting. But this time, it was different. This time, there was tension threaded through the stillness. She found the tracks, fresh, wide, heavy. Brutus was close, and so was something else. Her eyes swept the tree line. Somewhere behind her, a branch snapped. She turned, pulse racing, and there he was, Langford, standing 20 yards away, half-shrouded by pine, rifle slung casually over his shoulder, a smirk curling at his lips. "You must be the girl," he said, his voice rough like gravel. Funny how a scarred-up grunt and a wild animal always seemed to find each other. Nora didn't answer. She stared at him with the same calm she had offered Brutus. "You're trespassing," she said quietly. Langford shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. "So is the bear." He took a step forward. Then the forest moved. Brutus emerged from the trees like the rising of a mountain, silent, massive, eyes locked on the man who had once tried to destroy him. Langford raised his weapon but didn't aim. He froze. Brutus didn't growl. He didn't lunge. He stood tall, breath steaming in the cold air, every muscle a warning. Langford stared for a long moment, then something in his bravado cracked. He took a step back, another, then turned and vanished into the snow without a word. Nora didn't move until Brutus came closer, close enough that she could see the snow clinging to the fur around his jaw. He lowered his head toward her, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. She reached out, brushing her gloved fingers against his massive shoulder. "You're safe," she whispered. Back at the cabin, Ethan watched the feed. He saw the confrontation, saw how Brutus chose not to strike. "He's not just surviving," Ethan whispered to himself. He's choosing peace. But peace in the Bitterroot is never promised, it is earned. And in that moment, beneath the snow, beside the woman who sang to him, Brutus, the phantom of the pines, chose to stand his ground, not as a beast hunted, but as something greater, a guardian, a witness, a living story of survival told in breath, silence, and trust. The storm rolled in with the kind of weight that made the trees lean and the earth go silent, as if the forest itself held its breath. Snow came hard and fast, blanketing the Bitterroot in white sheets that blurred the edges of trails, covered the cabin roof in thick drifts, and swallowed sound until the world felt held in a hush. Inside the cabin, the fire popped and hissed, casting flickers of light across the wooden walls and the quiet figure seated beside it. Nora sat cross-legged on the rug, her hands still raw from the cold, eyes unfocused, the echo of Langford's retreat still pulsing in her memory. Brutus had not harmed him. He had not needed to. His presence alone had turned a predator into a shadow fleeing into snow in silence. That image of the bear standing between her and danger, of that immense creature choosing restraint, played over and over in her own mind like a song she couldn't forget. Beside her, Ethan stirred his tea, watching her from the rocking chair with the gaze of someone who knew how fragile peace could be. "You think he'll come back?" Nora asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan didn't answer right away. He glanced at the camera monitor resting on the edge of his desk, now flickering with static from the storm. "Maybe," he said. "But maybe now he understands that this isn't a place he can control." Outside, Brutus lingered near the tree line, his massive shape half hidden in the veil of snow, a sentinel wrapped in fur and scar. He had not gone far since the encounter, as if knowing Nora might still need him close. His wound was healing, the wrapping still snug thanks to Nora's careful work, though streaks of blood sometimes colored the white beneath his paws. He moved slower now, but not with pain, with intent. There was a purpose in his gaze, in the way he watched the forest. He was no longer running, and neither, it seemed, was Nora. Word of the bond between woman and bear had begun to travel beyond the woods. Ethan, against his instincts but guided by a deeper hope, had reached out to an old friend, a conservationist named Dr. Renee Lawson, who specialized in apex predators and human-wildlife bonds. Renee had been skeptical until she saw the footage. "This bear isn't just tolerating her," she said during their first call. "He's trusting her. That's unprecedented." Within a week, the story had reached a handful of circles, scientists, veterans, groups, environmentalists, and then spiraled outward into the public eye. News crews sent requests, organizations offered funding, and wildlife agencies voiced concern. Through it all, a single question hovered like mist over the forest: what should be done about Brutus? The local authorities were not impressed by the sentiment. Their position was clear: an unpredictable bear that had shown no fear of humans was a liability. There had been accidents before, stories of bears drawn too close, of hikers panicked into aggression. The sheriff's office issued a statement warning that relocation or euthanasia might be necessary if Brutus was seen again near public trails. "He's a wild animal," one official said in a televised clip. "Not a therapy tool, not a symbol. We can't afford to wait until someone gets hurt." Nora watched the segment from Ethan's laptop, her jaw tight, fingers clenched around a chipped mug. "They don't see him," she muttered. "They only see fear." Ethan didn't reply. He was watching her, not the screen. "Then let them see him," he said finally. Nora turned to him, confused. "What do you mean?" He reached for the binder he kept tucked beneath the maps on his shelf, flipping it open to a page filled with names. We invite them here. The officials, the skeptics, the ones calling for blood. We show them who he is. It was Sophie Kane who made it possible, the daughter of Edward Kane, a powerful landowner who had long advocated for stricter wildlife control. Sophie had seen the footage and requested to visit. She arrived one gray morning, wrapped in a parka, with quiet determination, her boots crunching on the frost as Ethan and Nora led her into the woods. She said little at first, observing everything: Nora's mannerisms, Ethan's setup, the terrain, the distant shapes marked on trail cams. When she finally spoke, it was with startling clarity. "If he appears today," she said, "you won't stop him from coming near me." Nora shook her head. "He'll come if he wants to, and if he doesn't, it's because he doesn't trust the moment, not because he's afraid." They waited by the creek for over an hour, the cold sinking deep into their clothes, until the sun cracked faintly through the trees. And then Brutus came. He stepped through the snow like a dream carved from earth, his fur dusted with frost, his breath steaming. He paused at the edge of the trees, nose lifted, catching Nora's scent. Then he moved forward slowly, one deliberate step at a time, until he stood a few feet from her. Nora held still, letting her breath sink with his rhythm. Sophie's eyes widened, her body rigid, but she didn't retreat. Brutus turned his head toward her, massive eyes meeting hers for a long, silent moment. Then he lowered himself onto his haunches and sat. That evening, back at the cabin, Sophie placed a call to her father. "You need to come see him," she said. "Not because of what he is, but because of what he isn't." It took another week of negotiation, a carefully worded permit, and a private escort for the gathering to be arranged. Wildlife officials, psychologists, veteran advocates, conservationists, even reporters with hushed voices and long lenses, all came to the edge of the woods on a day when the snow had softened, and the creek ran clearer than it had in weeks. Nora stood alone at the center of the clearing, Brutus's presence not guaranteed but hoped for. She had no leash, no tools, only trust. The forest gave no early warning, but Nora felt it in her bones the moment he came. Brutus emerged quietly, like he always did, and walked to her side. She reached out, fingers brushing his fur. The gathered crowd gasped, cameras clicked, someone began to cry. Brutus made no sound. He simply stood with her, peaceful, whole, unchained. Later, when the press conference began, Sophie Kane stood beside her father and cleared her throat. "We cannot destroy what we do not understand. This bear is not a threat. He is an opportunity to witness resilience, intelligence, and a bond that defies what we think we know." Her father, stone-faced and proud, stepped forward. "I was wrong," he said. "And I will do everything in my power to protect this place and this bear." By spring, the plan was in motion, a designated sanctuary woven into the heart of the Bitterroot, with monitored perimeters, cameras, and staff trained not in containment but in coexistence. Brutus would remain free, his movements tracked only for safety, not for control. Nora, now both caretaker and bridge between worlds, became the sanctuary's liaison. She led therapy sessions in the forest, silent walks, meditations by the creek, firelit conversations under the open sky. Veterans came in waves, broken in different ways but united by a longing for peace. And often, when words failed, Brutus would appear, not close, not always, but near enough to remind them they were not alone. In time, their story became a kind of legend, the bear who trusted, the soldier who healed. A symbol not of domestication, but of dignity. And though the world moved on, churning with headlines and noise, the Bitterroot remained unchanged in its essence, wild, watchful, whole. On certain mornings, when the air was thick with mist and the birds sang low, Ethan would sit by his monitors, sipping coffee, eyes soft as he watched Nora walk the old trail, sometimes alone, sometimes with others, and sometimes, most sacred of all, with the great bear beside her. Footsteps aligned, breath rising like smoke from a shared fire. The phantom of the pines was no longer a warning. He was a witness, a guardian, a friend. Spring unfurled slowly across the Bitterroot, peeling back the last fingers of frost with sunlight that lingered a little longer each day. The trees, once stiff with cold, now swayed with newborn leaves, their branches whispering secrets between the breeze and the sky. The forest was changing, softening, healing. And so was Nora. Her footsteps, once burdened by dread and silence, now moved with quiet confidence through the sanctuary trails. She had memorized every bend of the creek, every outcrop where the moss clung like velvet to stone, and most importantly, every path Brutus favored. In the early light, he was still wild, still vanished for days at a time, but when he returned, it was never random. He came when he was needed, always had. Sometimes, he came without being seen, and Nora would only know by the sudden hush in the trees, the unmistakable indentation of massive paws in the soft soil, or the moment when a war-worn veteran sitting beside her by the fire would lift their head and say, "I don't know why, but I feel like someone's watching." And Nora would smile gently and say, "That's not someone to fear. That's someone who understands." The sanctuary had grown faster than anyone expected. What began as a quiet corner of protected land, watched over by a handful of biologists and volunteers, soon bloomed into something larger, a place where two types of scars, human and animal, could be seen and accepted without judgment. Veterans arrived from all over, drawn by whispers of a woman who found her voice in the woods and a bear who had once walked alone but now walked beside her. Some came skeptical, others desperate, many broken in places they didn't know how to name. The forest didn't demand explanations. It offered breath, space, with its eyes, stillness. And Brutus offered something that no one else could, presence without expectation. He didn't comfort, he didn't approach with the gentleness of a pet. He simply was. And for many, that was enough. To sit near a creature that should fear or hate humans but chose stillness instead, it shattered walls words never could. Nora had found her rhythm as a guide. She spoke more now, but only when it mattered. Her strength came not from teaching or preaching, but from listening. She knew what silence needed. When she walked with new arrivals, she didn't lead from ahead. She walked beside them, letting the forest do what it had done for her, slow the heartbeat, quiet the noise, show that pain didn't have to mean isolation. Her sessions were simple, mornings by the creek, afternoons tending to the small garden near the cabins, evenings gathered in a circle with stories shared over the crackle of firewood. Every so often, Brutus would appear at the edge of the clearing, not a guest, not a symbol, just another survivor choosing to remain. His presence was never announced, never controlled, and never turned into a spectacle. That was Ethan's rule and Nora's vow. This place was not for fame, it was for healing. Still, word of Brutus and Nora continued to ripple outward. Documentarians called, biologists asked for research rights, and politicians posed for photos, but the sanctuary remained untouched by ambition. When Sophie Kane helped broker a deal with private donors to fund its long-term future, she made only one demand: that Nora retain full authority over what happened within its borders. Nora agreed on one condition, that a percentage of the funds go toward veteran services and anti-poaching efforts. "We're all trying to protect something," she had said. "It only works if the protection goes both ways." Ethan, now more observer than guardian, watched all of this unfold with a mixture of pride and quiet caution. He still checked his cameras every day, still walked the fence lines when he could, his old boots crunching across pine needles and gravel. His body was slower now, joints aching with the seasons, but his mind remained sharp. One evening, sitting with Nora beneath a soft starlit sky, he turned to her and asked, "Do you ever wonder why it was you?" She didn't need clarification, she knew he meant the bear, the bond, all of it. She thought for a long moment before replying, "Maybe because I wasn't afraid to be broken in front of him," she said. "I think he recognized that." Ethan nodded slowly. "Or maybe," he said with a half-smile, "he just liked your singing." It was late summer when the peace was broken again, not by violence, but by fragility. Brutus vanished longer than usual. Days turned into a week, then another. The cameras showed no sign, tracks grew cold. Nora searched the trails she knew best, humming softly as she walked, her heart tight with a worry she tried to keep from the others. Ethan offered theories. He might have moved higher for cooler weather or followed a scent line past the sanctuary border. But Nora felt something different, not panic, not fear, but an ache she hadn't felt since the day he first appeared to her, raw and limping near the creek. She found him on the 12th day, high in the ridgeline near a fallen tree split by lightning long ago. Brutus was lying in the shade, his breathing shallow, his eyes still bright but his body thinner, slower. The old wound had healed long ago, but time was catching up with him now. He didn't rise when she approached, instead, he looked at her and let out a low, steady sound, neither pain nor greeting, just acknowledgement. She sat beside him for hours, saying nothing, letting the wind move between them like a conversation. When she finally spoke, it was a whisper. "You gave me a path back," she said. "Now I'll walk with you as far as you need." Brutus stayed there for 2 more days. Nora returned each morning with water, fruit, and warmth. On the 3rd morning, she arrived to find him still and silent, his massive head resting on the moss, eyes closed as if in sleep. She knelt beside him and pressed her hand gently to his fur. It was cold. Her breath caught, and for a long time, she didn't move. The forest around her was still, no bird song, no breeze, just the steady hum of a world that understood morning. When she finally stood, she looked to the sky and felt not emptiness, but fullness. Grief, yes, but wrapped in gratitude. Brutus was buried beneath the ridge, his resting place marked by a single stone carved with his likeness. No name, no dates, just a symbol etched in silence. The sanctuary held a small gathering, not a funeral, but a tribute. Veterans shared what the bear had meant to them. Ethan read a passage from an old field journal. When her turn came, Nora stepped forward and said only one thing: "He saw us before we saw ourselves." Time moved on. The forest shifted again. Leaves turned, fell, and regrew. New bears wandered into the edges of the sanctuary, never quite like Brutus, but each watched with cautious hope. Nora remained, her role evolving from guide to guardian. Ethan eventually retired for good, passing the stewardship to a small team trained in his ways, but he still visited, always carrying the same worn notebook, always leaving with new names to write down. The sanctuary thrived. More than a refuge, it became a bridge, a testament to what could be healed when fear was met with understanding. Years later, when Nora stood with a new group by the creek, a child among them pointed to a rustle in the trees and asked, Is that the bear everyone talks about? Nora smiled softly. No, she said. But maybe it's a reminder. She looked to the trees, to the place where Shadow once walked beside her, and felt again the weight of that silent companionship. The phantom of the pines was gone, but he had not vanished. He had become part of the forest, part of the story, and in every breath of wind through the trees, in every quiet footstep beside the water, his legacy lived on, not as a ghost of fear, but as a guardian of trust and the first to teach a broken soldier how to walk home again.